started. So, today's workshop is on plagiarism. So, a topic that I think can be beneficial across your whole degree to learn about, and to learn about what is plagiarism and how to avoid it essentially. So I'll be bringing you through all of these points today. So let's get stuck in. So today we will be covering what is plagiarism, how is plagiarism identified, what are the consequences of plagiarism, and how to avoid it. Very important. So let's get stuck in. Obviously, you are interested enough in what plagiarism is, to come to this workshop. But what is the actual definition of plagiarism? Well, by the UCD plagiarism policy, it describes plagiarism as the inclusion in any form of assessment of material without due acknowledgement of the source. And I've included a link in the slides to the full policy, so you'll be able to get that full policy after this session and have a full read through if you need to. But essentially, plagiarism is presenting someone else's work as your own, and it's often referred to the theft of ideas. And really, the definition of plagiarism is pretty big. I think a lot of people have some maybe preconceived ideas of what plagiarism is, and indeed many of those are probably accurate. But I think plagiarism can span a bit bigger than a lot of people and students maybe originally think it is. So, what kinds of things could be plagiarism? So it could be work written by somebody else with or without permission. So, for instance, if maybe a family member or a friend gave you some text to include in an assignment, that would be considered plagiarism. So, even if they gave you permission to use it, it is still plagiarism. It could be something that's written by somebody you don't know, and maybe you're using it without permission, or maybe it's by somebody you do know and you're using it without permission. But either way, if it's something somebody else has written and then you're putting it into your assignment or your project or your presentation, it would be considered plagiarism. Another one that Another example of plagiarism could be work purchased through any source. So, for instance, there are, ghostwriters or writers out there who are willing to write your essay, maybe part of an essay or the whole thing, at a cost. But if you were to submit work that was purchased and it was written by somebody else and you purchased it, that would be considered plagiarism, and quite a serious form of plagiarism. Plagiarism can include presenting ideas, theories, concepts, methodologies, or data from the work of another without due acknowledgement. So I suppose the question there is, what is due acknowledgement? That means that you're presenting somebody's work. You're working off their ideas, you're working off maybe research they've done and their findings, and you're presenting it, but you're not giving them the credit. So you're not citing them, you're not referencing them in your reference list, in your bibliography with insight references. That would be considered giving them due acknowledgement. So it's a very important thing. And I think this is where a lot of difficulties come up for students, is that they've read something somewhere, a piece of research or somebody's opinions and arguments on something, and they want to include it in their own essay. And you can, of course, do that in different ways, but you need to give that due acknowledgement. Plagiarism can also be presenting text or images copied with only minor changes without due acknowledgement. So maybe you've made a few changes, but again, you need to cite the original source and give reference to it. And quite similarly, paraphrasing without due acknowledgement of a source is considered plagiarism. So paraphrasing something is very important when we're writing. We want to take what we've read, what we've learned, and we want to put it into our own words. But equally important, when we're putting it into our own words, we also need to still give that acknowledgement, that citation. So plagiarism again, it's a lot about citation, I won't lie, guys. It's failing to include appropriate citation for all original sources. But then I think these last two are maybe some things that people might not consider. I think, we kind of identify and we say, okay, if I buy an essay or if I take someone else's work and put it in word for word, or if I don't reference something, yes, I can understand how that's plagiarism, but these last two might be kind of forgotten about sometimes. So it is considered plagiarizing if you represent group work as solely your own. So if you were writing something about a group project you did, and you were involved in that group, and you only referenced it as your own work, that would be considered plagiarism. You still need to give credit to everyone who contributed to that work, and that's very important. And this one then I think shocks many people when they first hear about it, and the idea of self-plagiarism. So it doesn't have to be that you're using someone else's work. You can use your own. You can self-plagiarize and play, by your own work. So if you are presenting work for an assignment which has been submitted for another assignment at UCD or another institution, that is called self-plagiarism, and it can happen quite innocently sometimes, because obviously you might be expressing an idea that you've had, you're putting it into your own words, and sometimes it can happen in moments of stress. So for instance, if maybe you wrote an essay on a particular topic last year and you're taking kind of the next step up in the module, and maybe you're like, you know what, my introduction was just perfect last year, I'm going to include that again. I was really happy with how I put that in, and you copied and pasted that and put it into your new assignment. That would be self-plagiarism, and it would pop up. And not only would it pop up, it would be considered plagiarism. So very important that you're aware that even if you've written on a topic before, that you're not using the same material that you've previously submitted. You do actually need to change it. Otherwise it's plagiarism. I just saw a hand raised there, and if you want to pop it in the chat box, I'll be able to help then. So a lot of people then ask, well, what about common knowledge? Do I need to cite something that's common knowledge? And the fact is that you might not. So for instance, common knowledge is a fact that is widely known and accepted, and it doesn't need to be cited. So for instance, Michael D. Higgins is the President of Ireland, and you don't need to cite that. But you do need to cite research by others, ideas and analysis of primary research, facts that wouldn't be otherwise known if you hadn't researched them. So I suppose if you didn't know it before you came to this module, or before you came to study a particular topic, you do need to cite it and put in a reference. But if you are unsure if you should cite something, you're kind of toing and froing and saying, I'm not sure if that's general or common knowledge or not, it's often best to just cite it, just to make sure that you're covered. So a question that comes up quite a bit then is, well, can plagiarism be accidental? I think most people on this call certainly, and across the university, don't intend to plagiarize something. They're not trying to bend or break any rules. But what can it happen by accident? And the answer is yes, it can happen by accident, and in fact that is often the reason behind plagiarism. Really, very few students really intend to plagiarize something. They want to give, authors credit. They want to make sure that their essay is in line with academic integrity in the university, and that they don't want to take anyone else's ideas or take credit for them. But it can happen both intentionally and unintentionally. But whether it happens by accident or not, it is still a serious academic offence. And we'll go through in a minute what might happen if you are found to have plagiarized. So there are some forms of plagiarism, I guess, that are clearly intentional. If you ask for someone to purchase an essay for you, or if you purchase an essay that someone else has written for you, I think that would be, quite widely accepted as clear intended act of plagiarism. But often that it's just by accident. Maybe you're writing your notes on something and you forget to include a citation and you think, oh, I'll pop it in anyway. Or maybe you have a lot of workings with, copy and pasted material from original sources and you think that's how you wrote it and you pop it in your essay. So we will be going over now how to best avoid those kinds of accidental acts of plagiarism. But first, I really want to highlight to you what would happen if plagiarism is detected in your work. So if plagiarism is detected, you'll be invited to meet the school plagiarism committee. That's a meeting that you can bring someone else to if you want a little bit of support. And it will be really a meeting around discussing what's been identified and allows the students time to explain what happened, and for a decision to be made on if it is a true act of plagiarism, or if it maybe was just a misunderstanding and it was actually not plagiarism. If plagiarism has been found to occur, you may be able to, there's a kind of a few options of what might happen. For instance, you may be able to resubmit the assignment with a late submission penalty, or your grade will be capped or reduced. So I think it's often capped at a D plus, and that is often the outcome, particularly kind of in early days if this is your first instance of plagiarism. But there might be some capping without the chance to resubmit. But quite seriously, there may be a referral then to the student discipline procedure if this is a severe, incidence of plagiarism. And how they decide on that, it's completely not, up to whoever's there on the day. There's actually a whole system, and the decision is based on like a number of factors, including kind of the level of plagiarism, how much of the essay was plagiarized, for instance, and the number of previous plagiarism offences. So this is definitely not my intention to kind of scare anyone, but just to make you aware of what might happen if plagiarism is identified. So just to remember that it is a serious offence within the university, and it's something that is taken very seriously. So I suppose the question is then, well, how do they even identify plagiarism? How would anyone who's reading my essay even know? And there can be subtler kind of ways of detecting it. So for instance, as your lecturer or tutor is reading through an essay or an assignment, they might notice that your language, your tone, your style suddenly changes and it's jumping around the place a little bit. So maybe that would indicate that like a paragraph has been copied and pasted in. Even the font or the format changing can be kind of indicative of this. So for instance, it's going along in 10 Times New Roman and then it suddenly jumps to, 14 in Arial font. That would kind of be indicative of something being copied and pasted in to the essay, which might be an indication of plagiarism. It might be an indication that you copied and pasted your own notes and your own words and all this kind of stuff. So don't worry too much about that, but it's just a tool that can be used to identify plagiarism. It's also important to remember that, module coordinators, lecturers are very familiar with all the core texts that you'll be reading. So chances are, if you're writing, an essay for a particular topic, they've actually read the majority of those texts, articles, journals, that you're referring to. So they'll recognize the original piece of text in your essay if it maybe has been copied and pasted in. Or they'll recognise the thought if it hasn't been cited as somebody else's. But I suppose the main way that UCD identify plagiarism is that they have very sophisticated plagiarism detection software. So when you enter an essay, it's run through this software and a percentage will come back that says this amount of this essay has been plagiarized. Now, sometimes in certain subjects, a small percentage might come back because maybe something that, requires very particular language to be used might come back, or it's something you couldn't paraphrase. And within those schools, if that's the case, the school is understanding and they'll have advised you on what might be the case. So maybe if you get a report back from the plagiarism detection software and it has a few percent of plagiarism, don't panic, don't feel like you're going to be called up in front of the committee straight away. But if you do have any questions around what's an acceptable kind of percentage for it to come back with, speak to your module coordinators and let them know. It's really important to know that these softwares not only cross-reference your work against, published work, but also your own assignments so that you can't self-plagiarize, and other students' assignments and past assignments. So it's comparing them to, for instance, to the assignment that was submitted by, a student maybe 5 years ago. So I don't know if somebody you knew had already done the module, you would be compared to for plagiarism to that assignment as well. So we've kind of gotten a little bit of a feel now on what plagiarism is and how the university might detect it if it was present, and hopefully in many cases it won't be. But if it were present, I suppose the most important thing is that most people in this call really want to avoid plagiarism, or I assume most people across the university. And the question is, well, I know what it is now, how do I avoid it? So the first thing I would say is to look at how you take your notes. So when you're taking notes down for college, it's really important that you write down where you read that information. So if you're reading a book, or if you're reading a journal article, or you watched a video on something and you've written down some notes to remind yourself, write down where you found it. Enough information that if you needed to go back and find that again, you could, so that you can include the full reference if you need it. You don't know sometimes what information you'll use in an essay or a project later on in the trimester, or maybe even next year. So it's best to keep those notes organized from the beginning. So as you're reading something, write down the reference so that you can have it for any project or essay or assignment you write on that topic. It's also really important that if you're in a subject that requires you to write a bibliography, even if you don't refer to those facts or that knowledge you read explicitly, you still should include those references in your bibliography anyway, even if you're not going to be referencing them directly. And I suppose then if you do have sets of notes that don't have references and they're just things you've read over the last few weeks and you can't remember where you got that information, the best thing to do is to leave out that piece of information. We've gone over what the penalties for plagiarism are. They can be quite serious. They could be grades being capped, and they could be disciplinary proceedings. So even though sometimes it can be so tempting to put in that piece of information, maybe it's something that you really want to make a point on. If you can't find the original source to cite and reference that piece of information, it's best to leave it out of the piece of work. I suppose it's kind of on balance, whether you put that 1 point in might not bring up your grade a whole lot, but if you were found then to have plagiarized, or it could have quite a serious impact on the grade in the downward fashion. So as tempting as it is, I would say if you can't cite something, I'm afraid it can't go in the essay. So another tip then for how to avoid plagiarism is really simple. It's never to copy and paste text into your answer. And trust me, we're all absolutely surrounded by screens at the moment, and I know how tempting it is to, when you've got like split screens and you're reading something in a journal and you're like, I just want to copy and paste that over into my essay. I won't use it, I'll put it in red. We've all had these strategies we think will work to make sure that we don't use that information word for word from the original text, but really it can go quite sour quite quickly, I'm afraid. And often where we see incidences of plagiarism, it is when a student has copied and pasted something into their essay completely with the intention of deleting it, rewording it and deleting it, But in the kind of busyness of writing their essay, they then believe that this work was their own rewritten version and is left in, and it's a direct copy of what somebody else wrote. So even if you cite that, it still be considered plagiarism. So what you really need to be doing is paraphrasing your work. So it kind of goes hand in hand with not copying and pasting. What you need to be doing is reading something, maybe a book, an article, a piece of research, whatever it might be, an opinion piece, and then writing it down in your own words. And very importantly, even when you're writing something down in your own words, it's still based on somebody else's thoughts, ideas, research. So you need to include that citation. You need to make sure that you're still giving credit to that person while also expressing it in your own words. And writing something in your own words means changing more than just a few words or phrases. So it does need to be quite a significant change. And I have an example here, and I was trying to prepare for this, and I said, oh, what example am I going to give? Will I take one from the internet? Quite ironic, I think, on a plagiarism a workshop, but I decided to take one from my own thesis. So I did my thesis on online dating, what makes people attractive. So fun fact about me. And here I have a bit of the text from one of the original articles I referenced in my thesis. So we have the original text, and I put it here in quotation marks to make it absolutely clear that it is not my wording. It was original wording by Little and Jones. And it says, for masculinity preferences, one sample t-test against no preference, and then it had a load of statistics, revealed that women preferred more masculine faces for short-term relationships when fertile, and more statistics. Masculine faces were preferred, but not significantly, so for long-term relationships when fertile. So then I wrote my notes on this piece. I included in my notes that I had read that from Little and Jones, and when I went to write my thesis, I wrote it in my own words, including a citation. So I actually led with the citation, but the citation could be obviously in brackets at the end, in line with the referencing style for that I was required to do. So I said Little and Jones 2012 observed that when judging faces for short-term relationships, there is a preference for masculine faces when fertility is high in the observer, but not when judging faces for long-term relationships. So essentially, we've said much the same thing. I will say that the original Little and Jones has a little bit more detail that I've cut out just to fit it on one slide, but essentially we have said the same thing. But you can see there the tone is completely different, the sentence structure is completely different because I've put it in my own words. And I've adjusted it slightly to be absolutely relevant to what my research was asking and what question I was asking. So you can see the stark difference there, but if I had copied and pasted the original text in, instantly, not only the plagiarism detector picked that up very quickly, but even my supervisor reading that would see this sudden change in tone, in expression, and it would be very obvious to them that I had copied and pasted something. So when you're paraphrasing it, you still do need to include the citation. You need to put something in your own words, structure the sentence as you do naturally, and keep it in line with the rest of your work. So then another tip on how to avoid plagiarism is to include quotation marks. So in some subjects, you will need to quote a different source. I'm thinking about maybe something, let's say English, and you want to quote the original text. And in that case, we don't paraphrase Shakespeare, that kind of way. If we want to include a quote, that can be done, but we need to clearly mark quotation marks for an indentation. So and when you do use a quote, it should include a citation and a reference, which is really important that then the reader of your essay or assignment could go back and find that quote in the original source as well. So it's something very simple, adding quotation marks, but it clearly shows that you are not trying to present this work as your own. You are quoting the original source, and then you're going to discuss it. So then I think through this whole workshop, I've made a lot of references, ironically again, to referencing and citation. And that in itself is actually a whole workshop. So you need to be practicing referencing. Referencing is essential for every piece of work you submit in UCD. And we have already done a workshop on referencing, which is available on the All Student Support University for All Brightspace, which is the Brightspace we're on at the moment. And that we have a whole workshop, and there's a recording and slides on referencing and how it's done and why it's important, so you can link in there. But what I really do recommend is, for whatever style or styles of referencing you use in your school or in your subject, to look up the library website and find the referencing guide. So there's one for all the major styles of referencing, and literally have that saved to your desktop. So previously I've used, for instance, Harvard and APA as my styles, my referencing styles. So I'd have those documents on my desktop ready to go to look back on them, and they are the ultimate guide to referencing for each subject. They have so many examples on how you should reference. So for instance, hopefully this shows up big enough, but I've taken out some examples of what they have. So they have everything from how to, reference journal articles, websites. Here I have, how you reference a book with one author or two authors, and they go through it on, multiples of authors if it's from an editor. And they also have things like how to reference something you found on Twitter or Facebook or in a video. So really those guides are very thorough. There'll be some things that you use very frequently. For instance, if you're in science, you probably will mostly reference articles with however many authors, and maybe not a lot of Twitter. But maybe if you're in something like politics, you might reference, a lot of social media. There might be a bit more variety there. So there is a referencing guide for all the major styles of referencing. So I really encourage you to look at that, and the link is included in this workshop. And you can work on that, as well as maybe taking a look at the workshop that we've done on referencing. So I think they're really important, that there's kind of two bits to referencing or to avoiding plagiarism. It's definitely making sure that things are in your own words, but essentially across everything you include, whether it's a quote, a paraphrased item, statistics, anything like that, you need to include a reference. So you need to get familiar with referencing it to thoroughly avoid plagiarism. So does anyone have any questions that they'd like to pop in the chat box? Or I think you have the ability to unmute yourself. I hope you do. And you can ask that out loud. I'll stop the recording